The Galactic Academy of Dominion floated in the empty space between three dying stars. It was a massive structure made of black stone and strange metals that no human had ever seen before. For 3,000 years, the Valori Empire had used this place to train their best students in the art of controlling minds. They called it education. The rest of the galaxy called it terror. The Valori were tall and thin, with skin the color of pale moonlight and 4 eyes that could see into the thoughts of lesser beings. They believed they were gods. After conquering 600 worlds without ever losing a battle, no one had given them a reason to think otherwise. On this particular day, the Academy was preparing for its annual demonstration of supremacy. It was a celebration where the Empire showed its power by breaking the minds of captured aliens from newly discovered worlds. The students would watch. They would learn. And they would understand that the Valori were the true masters. Of all living things. Kang, Do-yoon did not know any of. This when he woke up in chains. The last thing he remembered was his small scout ship, spinning out of control near Jupiter. There had been a flash of light, a sound like thunder inside his skull, and then nothing. Now he was lying on a cold metal floor, his wrists bound in heavy restraints that glowed with a faint purple light. He was 32 years old, a sergeant in Earth's newly formed Space Defense Corps. He had a plain face, short black hair, and the kind of body that came from years of military training. There was nothing special about him. He had never been the strongest or the smartest in his unit. He had simply been the one who never quit. The door to his cell opened, and 2 Valori guards stepped inside. They were at least 7 feet tall, and their 4 eyes looked at him the way a child might look at an insect. "Stand," one of them commanded. The word appeared directly in Do-yoon's mind, bypassing his ears entirely. He stood. Not because he wanted to, but because he needed to see what he was dealing with. A good soldier gathered information before making decisions. The guards led him through long hallways filled with strange symbols and floating lights. Other prisoners walked in chains beside him. He saw creatures with scales, creatures with too many arms, creatures that seemed to be made of living smoke. All of them had the same look in their eyes. They had already given up. Do-yoon had not. They emerged into a massive hall that took his breath away. It was larger than any stadium on Earth, with seats rising up in circles toward a ceiling so high it disappeared into darkness. Thousands of young Valori sat in those seats, their pale faces turned toward a raised platform in the center. On that platform stood a throne made of black glass, and on that throne sat the most terrifying being Do-yoon had ever seen. Empress Yelvara the Undying had ruled the Valori for 900 years. She was beautiful in the way a knife is beautiful, all sharp edges and cold precision. Her 4 eyes glowed with a soft golden light, and when she looked at Do-yoon, he felt something push against, his thoughts like fingers trying to open a locked door. He pushed back. The Empress tilted her head slightly. It was a small movement, but Do-yoon noticed it. She had felt his resistance. "Bring forth the creature," she announced, her voice filling the hall without effort. The guards dragged Do-yoon to the center of the platform and forced him to his knees. Around him, the other prisoners were arranged in a line. The one with scales was crying. The one made of smoke had become so thin it was almost invisible. "Students of the Academy," the Empress said, rising from her throne. "Today you will witness the power that makes us the rightful rulers of all existence. Before you stand representatives of the lesser species. Watch carefully as we demonstrate why they will never be anything more than tools for our use." She walked along the line of prisoners, her long fingers brushing against their heads. One by one, they collapsed. The scaled creature began to laugh uncontrollably. The smoke being screamed in a voice like breaking glass. A small furry alien simply went still, its eyes empty and dead. The students applauded. Then the Empress reached Do-Yun. "This one," she said, and there was something new in her voice. Curiosity, perhaps. Or amusement. "This one is from a world called Earth, a young species. Primitive. They have only just learned to leave their own planet." She placed her hand on Do-Yun's head, and he felt the pressure increase. It was like someone was trying to pour hot water into his brain through his ears. Every instinct told him to surrender, to let go, to make the pain stop. But Kang Do-Yun had grown up poor in a small town where the winters were harsh and the work was endless. He had joined the military because it was the only way out of poverty. He had survived training that broke men twice his size. He had held his dying mother's hand for 3 days because the hospital was too far away, and he refused to let her die alone. He knew pain, and he knew that pain was temporary. He looked up at the Empress and said nothing, but his eyes said everything. The Empress pulled her hand back. For just a moment, something flickered across her face. Surprise? Concern? It vanished before Do-Yun could be sure. "Interesting," she murmured. Then she smiled, and the smile was worse than any threat. "Perhaps this one requires a more personal demonstration." She turned to her students. "Who among you wishes to prove their worth? Who will break this human's mind and show us the true power of the Valori?" Hands rose throughout the hall. Thousands of young Valori, eager to show their strength against a single helpless human. The Empress laughed. "So many volunteers. But this honor shall go to our finest student." She gestured to the front row. "Dazara, come forward." A young Valori female rose from her seat. She was perhaps 90 years old, which Do-Yun would later learn was barely an adult by their standards. But she moved with absolute confidence, and when she looked at Do-Yun, he saw no mercy in her 4 golden eyes. "This human will kneel before me within 30 seconds, Dazara announced. "His mind will shatter like glass, and he will worship me as his goddess for the rest of his short, miserable life." The students cheered. Do-Yun looked at the young Valori. Then he looked at the Empress. Then he looked at the thousands of faces staring down at him with contempt and amusement. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a voice that sounded like his old drill sergeant whispered, "When you're outnumbered, outgunned, and out of options, that's when you show them what humans are made of." Do-Yun smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. It was the smile of a man who had nothing left to lose and everything to prove. It was the smile that his ancestors had worn when they faced armies with nothing but sticks and stones. It was the smile of a species that had crawled out of the mud, survived ice ages and plagues and wars, and still refused to die. Dazara hesitated. Just for a second, just the smallest pause before she raised her hand to begin the demonstration. But that second was enough. Do-Yun saw the doubt, and he held onto it like a weapon, because doubt was the first crack in any wall. And humans had spent their entire history finding cracks and breaking through them. The demonstration was about to begin. Dazara had broken her first mind when she was 12 years old. It was a simple creature, a pet that belonged to one of the servants. She had reached into its tiny brain and turned its love into fear, its trust into madness. The creature had run in circles until its heart gave out. Her parents had been so proud by the time she was 30. She had graduated from animals to people. The Valori used prisoners for practice, beings captured from conquered worlds who had no value except as training tools. Dazara had broken 17 different species before she turned 50. Each one had been easier than the last dot. Now she stood before a human, and she felt something she had not felt in decades: excitement. "Watch carefully," she told the students. "The human mind is young and soft. This will be educational." She raised her hand and reached out with her thoughts. The technique was simple but powerful. First, she would find the human's deepest fear. Then she would make that fear consume him. His own mind would do most of the work. All she had to do was light the fire. She pushed into Dohan's consciousness, and she found a door. This was not unusual. All minds had some form of defense. But these defenses were usually made of emotion, things like denial or ignorance or false courage. They crumbled the moment real pressure was applied. The door in Do-Hyun's mind was different. It was not made of emotion. It was made of something harder, something that the Sara did not recognize. She pushed against it, and it did not move. She pushed harder, using techniques that had shattered the willpower of ancient warriors and wise scholars. The door held. Sweat began to form on the Sara's forehead. This had never happened before. The human was still kneeling, still bound in chains, still completely helpless in every physical sense. But his mind was a fortress. Is something wrong? The Empress asked. Her voice was light, almost playful, but there was a sharp edge beneath it. No, your radiance, the Sara said. The human is resistant, but resistance is temporary. She changed her approach. Instead of attacking directly, she tried to slip around the door to find cracks in the walls of his mind. Every consciousness had weaknesses. Everyone feared something. She found Doan's fears easily enough. He was afraid of small spaces. He was afraid of drowning. He was afraid of failing the people who depended on him. These were common fears, nothing special. But when she tried to use them against him, something strange happened. Do-Hyun acknowledged them. He did not hide from his fears or pretend they did not exist. Instead, he looked at them directly, almost calmly, the way a soldier might examine a weapon. Yes, he seemed to say, these are my fears. I carry them with me always. What of it? The Sara had never encountered this before. Fear was supposed to be a weakness. It was the crack that allowed the Valori to break any mind. But for this human, fear was just another part of his existence. He had accepted it so completely that it had no power over him. You do not understand, the Sara said out loud, her voice beginning to shake. You are weak. Your species is primitive. You should be begging for mercy. Do-Hyun looked up at her. His eyes were calm, patient, almost curious. Your people use fear as a weapon, he said. His voice was quiet, but in the silent hall, everyone heard him. But you have never met a species that lives with fear every day of their lives. He stood up. The chains still bound his wrists, but somehow, in that moment, they seemed unimportant. Humans fear everything, Do-Hyun continued. We fear death. We fear pain. We fear the dark. We fear each other. We fear the unknown. He took a step toward the Sara, and she found herself taking a step back. But we do not let fear stop us. We have learned to walk beside our fears, to use them as fuel, to turn them into strength. The Sara's hands were trembling now. She had put everything she had into breaking this human, and he was still standing. Worse, he was advancing. I will show you true power, she hissed, and she gathered every bit of her psychic ability. This would hurt. This might even damage her own mind. But she would not be humiliated by a creature that had only existed for a few thousand generations. She attacked. The mental assault was like a tsunami. It carried with it 90 years of training, 90 years of conquest, 90 years of absolute certainty that the Valori were superior to all other life. It crashed against the walls of Do-Hyun's mind with enough force to kill most beings instantly. Do-Hyun staggered. Blood dripped from his nose, then from his ears. His vision blurred, and for a moment, he felt himself falling into an endless darkness. But in that darkness, he found something. A memory. His grandfather, sitting by a fire during one of those harsh winters, telling him stories of their ancestors. Our people survived invasions, his grandfather had said. We survived occupation. We survived division. We survived because we are like water. You can strike water with your fist, and it will part. But the moment you pull your fist back, the water returns. We do not break. We flow. Diane stopped falling. He opened his eyes and looked at the Sara. She was pouring everything she had into her attack, her face twisted with effort, her body shaking with the strain dot, and then Do-hyun did something that no one had ever done before. Instead of just defending himself, he reflected her attack back at her. The technique was instinctive, not planned. Humans had no psychic training, no knowledge of mental warfare, but they had something else. They had millions of years of evolution in a world that was constantly trying to kill them. They had developed minds that could adapt to any threat, that could find solutions in the most desperate circumstances. Do-hyun's mind took the Zara's attack and turned it into a mirror. The Zara screamed. The sound was terrible, a shriek of pure agony that echoed through the hall. Blood poured from her nose, from her eyes, from her ears. She collapsed to the ground, her body convulsing, her four eyes rolling back in her head. The hall was silent. 3,000 students stared in disbelief at their fallen champion. The greatest prodigy of their generation lay broken at the feet of a primitive alien who should have been nothing more than a demonstration subject. The Empress stood frozen on her throne. For the first time in 900 years, she did not know what to say. Do-hyun wiped the blood from his face and looked up at her. "Your student made a mistake," he said. She thought fear was a weapon that only worked in one direction. He smiled that terrible smile again. Humans learned a long time ago that any weapon can be turned against its owner. You just need to wait for the right moment. The Empress descended from her throne, her robes flowing behind her like shadows. Her four eyes burned with a cold fury that had destroyed civilizations. "You," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "are nothing. A fluke. An accident of evolution." "Maybe," Do-hyun agreed. "But I'm still standing. And your prodigy is not." The Empress looked at the Sara, who was still twitching on the ground. Then she looked at the thousands of students, all of whom were staring at the human with something new in their eyes. Something the Valori had not felt in 3,000 years. Fear. "If one student cannot break you," the Empress said slowly, "then perhaps the entire academy will have to try." She raised her hand, and 3,000 minds turned toward a single human. The real test was about to begin. Park Yuna had been crawling through maintenance tunnels for 19 days. She was smaller than Do-hyun, which had probably saved her life. When the Valori ship had captured their scout vessel near Jupiter, the aliens had focused on the larger human. They had assumed that Yuna was either dead or unimportant. They had thrown her unconscious body into a waste disposal unit and forgotten about her. That was their first mistake. Yuna had woken up surrounded by garbage and darkness. She had a broken rib, a deep cut on her forehead, and no weapons. What she did have was 12 years of special operations training and a very personal desire to rescue her partner. The Valori Academy was not designed with human infiltrators in mind. Why would it be? No species had ever escaped Valori captivity, let alone launched a counterattack. The maintenance tunnels were barely guarded. The security systems were designed to detect psychic intrusions rather than physical ones. And the aliens had left detailed maps of the entire facility on terminals that any human child could have hacked. Yuna had spent 3 weeks memorizing patrol routes, stealing food from storage rooms, and slowly making her way toward the main power systems. She had no idea what the Valori were planning to do with Do-hyun, but she knew it would not be good. She needed to create a distraction. Now she crouched in a narrow space behind the Academy's secondary shield generator, watching the demonstration of supremacy through a small ventilation grate. She saw Do-hyun kneeling in chains. She saw the young Valori try to break him. She saw her partner stand up and make that alien scream. Yuna smiled. Same old Do-hyun. too stubborn to know when he was beaten. Then she saw the Empress raise her hand, and she knew what was coming. Through her stolen communicator, she whispered, "Hold on, partner. Just a little longer." In the Grand Hall, Do-hyun felt the weight of 3,000 minds pressing against his consciousness. If the Tsar's attack had been a tsunami, this was an ocean. An endless, crushing ocean of psychic pressure that wanted to erase everything he was and replace it with obedience. His knees buckled. He fell to the ground, blood flowing freely from his nose and ears. His vision went white, then black, then white again. Every nerve in his body screamed for him to surrender, to let go, to make the pain stop. The Empress watched with cold satisfaction. "You see?" she announced to her students. "No creature can resist the combined will of the Valori. This human is strong, but strength alone is not enough. He will break. They all break eventually." Do-hyun heard her voice as if from very far away. She was right, he realized. He could not win this fight. No single mind could withstand the pressure of 3,000 psychics. It was impossible. But then he remembered something his drill sergeant had told him during the worst day of basic training. They had been running through mud and freezing rain, carrying heavy packs, pushed far beyond what should have been humanly possible. "The body wants to quit," the sergeant had shouted. "The mind wants to quit. But there is something deeper than body or mind. Something that does not know how to quit. Find that something, and you will never be defeated." Do-hyun searched for that something now. He dug past the pain, past the fear, past the desperate screaming of his consciousness. He dug down to the place where his ancestors had found the strength to survive ice ages and famines and wars. He dug down to the core of what it meant to be human. And he found it. It was not courage. It was not strength. It was something simpler and more powerful than either. It was stubbornness. Pure, irrational, magnificent stubbornness. The refusal to give up simply because giving up was unacceptable. The determination to keep fighting not because victory was possible, but because surrender was not an option. Do-hyun opened his eyes. "No," he said. The word was small, barely audible, but it carried with it 200,000 years of human evolution. It carried the weight of every ancestor who had faced impossible odds and refused to die. It carried the essence of a species that had crawled out of the mud and reached for the stars simply because someone had told them they could. Not. The psychic pressure faltered. The Empress stared in disbelief. "Impossible," she whispered. "Your power requires belief," Do-hyun said, forcing himself back to his feet. Every word was agony, but he kept speaking anyway. "You need your victims to believe that you are stronger than them. You need them to accept their own defeat." He looked around the hall at the thousands of young Valori, all of whom were straining to break his mind. But humans do not work that way. We have spent our entire history being told that we cannot do things. We cannot fly. We cannot leave our planet. We cannot survive. And every single time, we have proven those words wrong. He took a step forward, then another. The psychic attacks continued, but they seemed weaker now, less certain. "You call us primitive," Do-hyun continued. "And maybe we are. We have no psychic powers. We have no advanced technology. We have short lives and weak bodies. But we have something you do not understand. We have the ability to believe in the impossible." The Empress raised her hand higher, pouring more of her personal power into the attack. "You will kneel," she commanded. "I will not. You will worship me as your goddess. I will not. You will break." Do-hyun smiled. Blood covered his face, his clothes, his hands. He looked like a dead man walking, but his eyes were alive with something the Valori had never seen before. "You first," he said. At that moment, the lights went out. Yuna had cut the power. The Grand Hall plunged into absolute darkness. The Valori, who had evolved on a world with 3 suns, had almost no ability to see without light. Their psychic connections, carefully maintained through visual contact and structured hierarchies, dissolved into chaos. Screams filled the darkness. Not human screams. Valori's screams died in the chaos. Do-hyun felt the chains around his wrists. They were designed for beings who feared pain, beings who would never deliberately hurt themselves to gain freedom. But Do-hyun had dislocated his thumbs twice during training exercises. It hurt like hell, but it was survivable. 2 quick movements, 2 sharp bursts of pain, and his hands were free. Yuna's voice crackled through the implant in his tooth. 30 seconds until backup power. Do-hyun cracked his knuckles. In the darkness, surrounded by enemies who could not see him, he was no longer a prisoner. He was a predator. "That's more than enough time," he replied. Then he went to work. The Valori had never experienced physical combat. They had never needed to. Why would gods lower themselves to fighting with their hands? But humans had spent millions of years perfecting the art of violence. They had studied every way to hurt, to disable, to kill with nothing but their bodies. Do-hyun moved through the darkness like a ghost. He did not attack randomly. He targeted the command structure, the guards, the instructors who stood near the platform. Each strike was precise, efficient, and utterly devastating. The Empress screamed for her guards, but her guards were already down. She called for her students to attack, but her students could not find the enemy. All they could hear were sounds of impact, sounds of bodies falling, sounds of their own people crying out in pain and confusion. When the backup lights flickered on 30 seconds later, the Grand Hall had been transformed. Do-hyun stood in the center of the platform, surrounded by fallen Valori. His prison uniform was torn and bloody. His face was pale from blood loss. But he was still standing, and the Empress was alone. "How?" she whispered. "How is this possible?" Do-hyun looked at her with something that might have been pity. "You spent 3,000 years conquering minds," he said. "You forgot that minds come attached to bodies, and bodies can be hurt." He picked up a guard's weapon and pointed it at the Empress. "Now," he said, "let us discuss the terms of your surrender." The Empress had not felt true fear in 900 years. She had forgotten what it was like to face an enemy she could not control, to stand before a being that did not bow to her power. Now, staring at the human who held a weapon to her face, she remembered, and she hated it. "You think you have won?" she said, her voice trembling with rage. "You have defeated a few guards. You have frightened some children. But I am Yelvara, the Undying. I have ruled this empire for 9 centuries. I have broken gods." "Then break me," Do-hyun said simply. The Empress raised her hand and unleashed everything she had. 900 years of accumulated power, 900 years of conquest and domination, all focused on a single human brain. Do-hyun staggered but did not fall. Blood poured from his nose, and his vision blurred, but he kept his weapon steady. His hand did not shake. "Is that all?" he asked. The Empress lowered her hand. For the first time in her impossibly long life, she understood that she had lost. Not because she lacked power, but because power was useless against someone who refused to acknowledge it. Around the hall, 3,000 students watched in silence. Many of them were crying. Their entire world was crumbling before their eyes. Everything they had been taught, everything they had believed, was being proven wrong by a single primitive creature who should have been nothing more than a training exercise. Yuna appeared from the shadows behind the throne. She was small and thin, covered in dirt and dried blood, carrying a bag full of explosives she had assembled from maintenance supplies. She looked like a ghost, and to the Valori, she was something far worse than she was the second human. "Charges are set," Yuna reported. "The shield generators are rigged to blow." The communication arrays are offline. And I found the prison block. 1,200 captives from 30 different species, all waiting for rescue. Dalhin nodded. Good work. The Empress stared at Yuna with wide eyes. There were 2 of you? All this time, there were 2 humans on my station? You threw me in the garbage, Yuna said. You assumed I was dead or useless. You did not even bother to check. We thought humans were primitive, the Empress whispered. We thought you were harmless. That, Dalhin said, is the most dangerous assumption you could have made. He lowered his weapon slightly, not out of mercy, but because he had a more important message to deliver. Here's what is going to happen, he said. You are going to release every prisoner in this facility. You are going to give us a ship capable of reaching human space. And you are going to broadcast a message to every system in your empire. What message? Dalhin smiled. The truth. The Empress laughed, though there was no humor in it. You want me to tell my empire that 2 humans brought the Academy to its knees? You want me to admit weakness before the entire galaxy? I want you to do something more important than that. Dalhin looked around the hall at the terrified students, at the fallen guards, at the broken remnants of Valori supremacy. I want you to tell every species you have conquered that you can be beaten. I want you to show them that fear is a choice, not a destiny. That would destroy my empire. Yes, Dalhin agreed. It would. The Empress was silent for a long moment. Then she asked a question that surprised even herself. Why? You could kill me. You could take your ship and escape. Why demand this message? What do you gain from freeing species you have never met? Dalhin thought about the question carefully. It was a good question, one he had been asking himself ever since the lights went out. When I was a child, he said, my country was divided. Half of my people lived under a government that controlled everything they thought and said and did. They were told they were free, but they were prisoners. They were told they were happy, but they were suffering. He looked at the students in the seats, young Valori, who had been raised to believe they were gods. Eventually, the truth reached them. They learned that another way was possible. They learned that the chains they wore were not unbreakable. And when they learned that, they found the courage to break them. Dalhin turned back to the Empress. Your empire is built on a lie, he said. The lie that you cannot be resisted. The lie that surrender is the only option. I am going to destroy that lie, not because I hate the Valori, but because every being in this galaxy deserves to know that they have a choice. The Empress looked at him for a long time. Then, slowly, she nodded. You are either the bravest creature I have ever met, she said, or the most foolish. Probably both, Dalhin admitted. That is very human of me. The next few hours were tense but efficient. Under Yuna's supervision, the Academy's remaining staff opened the prison blocks and released 1,200 captives. Some of them had been there for decades. Some had been born in captivity and had never seen their homeworlds. All of them looked at the 2 humans with a mixture of awe and disbelief. A ship was prepared, a Valori cruiser large enough to carry all the free prisoners to neutral space. Yuna rigged the navigation systems to prevent any tracking and remove several key components from the Academy's pursuit. Vessels docked and in the Grand Hall, with 3,000 students watching. Empress Yalvara, the Undying, recorded a message. Citizens of the Empire, she said, her voice flat and empty. Today, 2 beings from a primitive species called humanity infiltrated the Academy of Dominion. They resisted our psychic control. They defeated our guards. They freed our prisoners. She paused, and something flickered in her golden eyes. They proved that we are not invincible. They proved that fear can be overcome. They proved that the foundation of our power is weaker than we believed. She looked directly into the recording device. To every species under our rule, You have been told that resistance is impossible. Today, I tell you that this is a lie. Two humans with no psychic ability, no advanced weapons, and no support brought my academy to its knees. If they can do this, then perhaps you can too. The recording ended. Da-Hyun ordered it transmitted to every communication relay in the Empire. As the freed prisoners boarded the cruiser, one of them approached Do-Hyun. He was an old creature, covered in blue scales, with eyes that had seen centuries of suffering. "Why did you do this?" he asked. "You could have simply escaped. Why risk everything to free us?" Do-Hyun thought about all the reasons he could give. Strategic advantage. Moral obligation. The hope that freed species would become allies to humanity. All of those reasons were true, but none of them were the whole truth. "Because that is what humans do," he finally said. "When we see people in chains, we try to break those chains. When we see bullies hurting the weak, we fight the bullies. It is not always smart. It is not always safe. But it is who we are." The old creature studied him for a long moment. Then he did something that surprised both of them. He bowed. "My people have a prophecy," he said. "They say that one day, a species will come from the outer darkness. A species that does not fear the gods. A species that will teach the galaxy how to be free." He straightened up and looked at Do-Hyun with something like hope. "I think you might be that species." Do-Hyun did not know what to say to that. So he simply nodded and walked toward the ship behind him. The Academy of Dominion stood silent and broken. Its halls, which had once echoed with the screams of tortured minds, were empty. Its students, who had once believed themselves to be masters of the universe, sat in stunned silence. And somewhere in the vastness of space, a message was spreading. A message that said the impossible was possible. A message that said chains could be broken. A message that said humanity had arrived. 6 months after the incident at the Academy of Dominion, the Valori Empire was burning. It had started slowly. A rebellion on a mining world near the Outer Rim. A protest on a farming colony that had been under Valori control for 800 years. A coordinated attack on a supply convoy by species that had never worked together before. Then the Empress's message had spread to every corner of the galaxy, and slowly became a fire that could not be contained. 17 major rebellions erupted in the first 3 months. Species that had been enemies for generations joined forces against their common oppressors. Psychic attacks that had once crushed all resistance now failed against beings who had learned a simple truth. Fear only works if you let it. The Valori did not understand what was happening. For 3,000 years, they had ruled through mental domination. They had never needed armies or weapons or strategy. Why would gods need such things? But now their power was failing, and they had no backup plan. Some of them tried to adapt. They built weapons and trained soldiers and formed defensive alliances. But they were starting from nothing, and their enemies had been preparing for this moment their entire lives. Others simply gave up. They retreated to their home systems and closed their borders, hoping that the storm would pass. It did not, and a very few, began to ask questions that had never been asked before. Questions like, was our empire ever truly just? Did we have the right to rule others simply because we could? What does it mean to be a god if your power can be broken by 2 humans with no special abilities? These questions had no easy answers. But the fact that they were being asked at all was perhaps the most significant change in Valori society in 3,000 years. On Earth, Kang Do-Hyun became the most famous person in human history. He did not enjoy the attention. He refused most interviews, declined offers to write books or appear in documentaries, and spent most of his time avoiding the crowds that gathered wherever he went. When reporters managed to corner him, he always said the same thing. It was not about being special. Any human could have done what I did. That is the point. They did not understand. They wanted a hero, a Superman, a chosen one who had been destined from birth to change the galaxy. They did not want to hear that the extraordinary things he had done were simply the result of ordinary human stubbornness. Yun handled the fame better. She gave speeches and wrote reports and helped train the next generation of human soldiers for the conflicts that everyone knew were coming. She became the face of Earth's new space defense initiative, a program designed to prepare humanity for its role in a galaxy that had suddenly become much more complicated. The Galactic Council, a loose alliance of spacefaring species that had existed for millennia, formally recognized humanity as a member. But they did more than that. They created a new designation, one that had never been used before. Class 1 cognitive threat. It was not a compliment, exactly. It was a warning. A warning to every species in the galaxy that humans were different, that they could not be controlled through fear or psychic manipulation, that they would fight against impossible odds and somehow win. Some species saw this warning and decided to avoid humanity entirely. They closed their borders and refused all contact, hoping to wait out whatever chaos the humans would bring. Others saw an opportunity. They sent ambassadors and trade delegations and military advisors, eager to learn from the only species that had ever successfully resisted Valori domination. And a few saw something else entirely. They saw hope. The old creature with blue scales who had spoken to Dohyun on the academy became the leader of his people's rebellion. He used the tactics that Yuna had taught him, the same tactics that humans had developed over millions of years of fighting each other. His people freed their homeworld within 8 months. Similar stories played out across the galaxy. Former slaves became freedom fighters. Crushed civilizations rebuilt themselves. Species that had forgotten their own histories began to remember who they had been before the Valori came. And everywhere, the same phrase was repeated. It became a battle cry, a prayer, a symbol of defiance against any who would try to rule through fear. They did not submit. They adapt. Empress Yelvara survived the collapse of her academy, but her power never recovered. She retreated to the Imperial Palace on Valori Prime and refused to see anyone. Some said she had gone mad. Others said she was simply waiting for death. The truth was simpler and sadder. She was thinking. For 900 years, she had believed that she was a god, that she had the right to rule because she had the power to rule. That might made right and strength justify domination. Now, alone in her empty palace, she was forced to confront the possibility that everything she had believed was wrong. That power was not the same as virtue. That fear was not the same as respect. That the empire she had built was not a civilization, but a prison. These thoughts brought her no comfort. But they did bring her something else, something she had not felt in centuries. Change. On the 1-year anniversary of the Academy incident, she made one final broadcast. Her voice was tired and her eyes were dull, but her words were clear. To the people of the galaxy, she said, I have spent my life believing that the strong should rule the weak. I have caused suffering beyond measure. I have destroyed countless minds and broken countless spirits. She paused, and for a moment, she looked almost human. I was wrong. Strength without wisdom is tyranny. Power without mercy is cruelty. And any empire built on fear deserves to fall. She looked into the recording device one last time. The humans taught me this. They showed me that the most powerful force in the universe is not psychic domination or military might. It is the simple refusal to accept defeat. It is the stubborn belief that things can be better. It is hope. The recording ended. 3 days later, Yelvara the Undying took her own life. She left no note, no explanation, no final words. She simply stopped existing, as quietly as a candle flame going out. Some said she was a coward. Others said she was finally facing justice for her crimes. But a very few, said that she had done something far more difficult than dying God. She had admitted that she was wrong. Years passed. The galaxy changed. New alliances formed and old enemies made peace. Species that had never met before discovered that they had more in common than they had imagined. And at the center of it all, humanity continued to grow. They spread across the stars, building colonies and making friends and sometimes making enemies. They were not perfect. They made mistakes. They fought among themselves and struggled with their own demons. But they never stopped hoping. They never stopped fighting for what they believed in. And they never ever learned how to quit. Kang Do-yoon lived to be 93 years old. He spent his final years in a small house by the ocean, watching the waves and thinking about everything that had happened. When reporters asked him for his final thoughts, he gave them the same answer he had always given. Any human could have done what I did. That is the point. But this time, he added something more. The Valori believed they were gods because they could control minds. They thought that made them special. But being special is not about power. It is about choice. It is about deciding who you want to be and then becoming that person, no matter how hard it is. He looked out at the ocean, at the endless water that had once been humanity's greatest obstacle and had become their greatest teacher. Humans are not special because of what we can do. We are special because of what we choose to do. We choose to hope. We choose to fight. We choose to believe that tomorrow can be better than today. He smiled. The same smile he had shown the Empress all those years ago. And that, he said, is something no one can ever take away from us. The old man closed his eyes and let the sound of the waves wash over him. Somewhere out in the galaxy, his legacy lived on. Not in statues or monuments or history books, but in the simple truth that he had proven to the universe. Humans do not submit. They adapt.